Hello, it's Silver, and this is ArcRunner. ArcRunner is a roguelite third-person shooter that is, of course, in a very obviously cyberpunk style. It's based around going through multiple bits of these sections, each section consisting of about 7 levels, and they all have their own tilesets and enemy types and so forth, and as you progress through the sections, of course, it'll get harder and harder, with the 4th area of every section having a sort of mini-boss fight against some elites, and then the 7th area of a section having a big final boss battle before you move on to the next one. The game also actually has 3-person co-op. It's a bit of an unusual number, 3 instead of 4, but the reason for 3 is because this is a class-based game, and there are 3 different classes to choose from, so 3 players. Each of the classes plays quite a bit different from each other. They all start with 1 weapon slot as well as a melee weapon to begin with, and they also have some sort of active skill as well as an ultimate skill once you unlock it, and a couple of other little bits like passives and stuff. So they do have quite a bit of variance in between them, and their playstyles are quite different and also augmented very well with some of the upgrades and weapons and stuff that you can find to make a good variety of builds for each one possible. For instance, the soldier, the initial starting character, has a very useful deflection shield that you can put up in order to just deflect any projectiles back at their source. It has a limited energy meter, and the more powerful moves you deflect, the more it depletes this meter, and eventually when it runs out, of course, you can't deflect at all until it recharges some, so you gotta be careful about that. He also has a big hammer, sort of like a lightning hammer, that does quite a bit of damage in an AoE around him, but is very slow to swing. And his ult is effectively invincibility for a short time, which is obviously quite handy. The next character is the ninja, who I personally find very, very fun. They can turn invisible instead of having a shield. The invisibility is complete, as in like nothing will see them at all while they're invisible, which is very powerful, but of course it does use up this energy gauge very quickly, so you can't use it for too long. They also gain access to a katana instead of the hammer. The katana is much, much faster and has a 3-hit combo, with the 3rd hit doing a big amplified hit of damage, and overall the katana is very powerful in this game, but that's probably because enemies in melee also do a ton of damage, so it has to be worth it to actually make you able to get that close. You know, if you're willing to get that close to an enemy, you gotta have some sort of good payoff for it, because enemies get very dangerous when they get close to you. The ult for the ninja is like a bouncing projectile that just bounces all over the place and does damage to everything it bounces to, quite a bit of damage as well. And also you have a dodge in this game. All characters get a dodge, except it does not have immunity frames, so that's something to get used to. You can't dodge through projectiles, you have to dodge away from them instead. And the ninja actually gets a double dodge, unlike the other characters that only get 1. And the 3rd character is the hacker. You have to actually unlock the hacker by getting to the Eden Heights area for the first time, which is the 3rd region on your adventure. And the hacker is hard to play, but very fun. They're a bit more fragile. They also fly, or well, levitate. They can't just fly anywhere, but they can levitate through the air, which is useful in certain circumstances. They also have a sort of AoE chargeable shock blast instead of a traditional melee weapon. If you just tap it, you get a simple blast of like electricity around you, but you can also charge it up to make the area larger and start to stun enemies around you, which can also be nice to have because, you know, it's very easy to get overwhelmed in this game. There are a lot of enemy spawns later on, so having some sort of AoE crowd control is nice. But their main feature, the one that uses their energy gauge and replaces the deflection shield and the invisibility from the other 2 characters, is of course hacking. And hacking has 4 different functions that you can use depending on what you're actually targeting. You can use it on enemies, for instance, to actually drain their health away and restore some of your own from a distance. You can also cause it to remotely detonate any sort of volatile things in the arenas, because the arenas often have explosive barrels and power junctions and stuff that you can damage. This allows you to detonate them remotely without having to shoot them. The hacker can even, although it's on a bit of a cooldown, spread this sort of damage over time plague through enemies that are crowded together, as well as even convert an enemy to your side for a limited time and actually have it fight for you. So the hacker has a lot of possibility, a lot of power, but is more difficult to use in general. Whenever you complete one section of an area, you will go into this chair, this sort of auto-dock surgery chair, and you can choose from 4 different upgrades, 1 of 4 different, you can only choose 1. And there's an upgrade for each of your sort of body slots. There's a head, a legs, an arm, and a torso upgrade slot. And the 4 different upgrades that you'll get presented with at the end of a level are randomized each time, although if you have one upgrade in any of these slots, it is more likely to give you that one again, because the upgrades actually stack. You can purchase, or will get, the same upgrade multiple times in a row to empower it in some way, and also once you get to 5 of a single upgrade, it will unlock some sort of extra passive benefit. Some of the upgrades are generic, they're available to everyone, whereas some of them are class-specific because they improve the class's abilities in some way. So for the generic upgrade, you might get something like the ability to automatically have some of your health appear as armor at the beginning of every level. Armor is just a yellow fraction of your health gauge that takes damage before your actual health does. It's like a shield. And this upgrade gives you an auto-regenerating armor that applies at the beginning of each level. Or you could also just simply get a ranged damage increase. This is a very simple one, but it's very useful because, hey, more damage is always nice to have. And as you level this up, if you get to the 5 threshold, it'll actually start to improve your damage against elites and bosses an additional percentage as well, making you into sort of like a boss killer build. But if you're looking into more of the class-specific upgrades, you get stuff like, for the ninja, for instance, there's an upgrade that makes it so the whole time you're invisible, you're charging up this AoE, and as soon as you turn uninvisible again, you burst out this AoE in a big stun, so it stuns everything that you turn back visible near. So you can actually use it to, like, assassinate high-priority targets or something like that, or take care of large groups. You know, you just appear in the middle of them and stun all of them in an AoE. So the class-specific augments that you find at the end of levels are definitely always worth having. They're worth picking whenever they show up because, you know, your class's skills are very strong to start with, so being able to improve them in specific ways is really nice. Now, of course, you also do have weapons that you're equipped with. At first, as I mentioned earlier, you'll start with just one weapon slot. However, there is a pretty significant progression tree. You'll get this currency that you can use in between runs to improve yourself in various ways, and there's a bunch of different nodes to improve, from basic stuff like starting with more health, to upping the damage of everything, to unlocking entirely new mechanics. Like, for instance, the previously mentioned ults for each class are not actually unlocked at first. You have to buy the ult node on the progression tree to have access to those. But one of the nodes allows you to also hold more weapons. So you'll start with one, but you can then earn the ability to have 2 weapons, and then after that you can get 2 weapons and a heavy weapon. Those work a little bit differently and take up their own slot. And I would personally say that the weapons in this game are kind of the star of the show. They're where a lot of the most interesting aspects of the combat actually lie. There's quite a bit of variety in the weapons, and at first you'll only start with just a couple of basic things like a pistol, but you'll eventually get some other more basic weapons like a simple assault rifle, an SMG, and a shotgun. And the way it works is before every run you start in this sort of armory area that shows all the weapons that you've picked up. All you have to do is pick them up once and they'll appear in this armory, and then each weapon will have a specific number of kills you have to get to it to unlock that weapon, and then after you do that you can start with it on all future runs. So you're basically encouraged to swap out your main weapon pretty often and actually try to rack up kills with each different one to start unlocking them so you can have a more complete arsenal and to choose what different sort of loadout you actually want to begin with every time you start. And as you get deeper through the levels, you'll start finding more and more different kinds of weapons. The first area of the game, the first sort of city area, only has just a couple of basic weapons, but once you get past that to the more exciting areas beyond, you'll start seeing much of a larger variety of drops and things. You can also, by the way, drop these activatable skills that you can get, things like plasma grenades, stun grenades, auto turrets, and stuff like that. And then by the time you get to the second tile set, the dock area, you will start finding heavy weapons occasionally. And heavy weapons, like I mentioned, take up their own slot, so at first you won't be able to actually equip these until you purchase that node in the progression tree that allows you to use them. And then once you do use them, you'll notice they actually have ammo, which is unusual, because the main weapons in this game actually have infinite ammo. Many of them have to be reloaded, so they have an ammo count, but you don't have an actual ammo pool. They are infinite. You can reload them as much as you want. Some weapons also have just an infinity symbol, so they can be fired indefinitely, like the discus launcher, for instance, which is really fun to use. And there's also some weapons that have more of a charge-based thing, where the longer you fire them, the charge builds up in this gauge, and once it fills, they overheat, and you can't fire them for a little while. But the heavy weapons do actually take an ammo resource that can run out, and once the heavy weapon ammo runs out, then you have to find these little red drops that appear on the ground. They sort of look like little red beams that drop in the middle of enemy formations and stuff, and these will be refills to whatever heavy weapon you happen to have equipped. And these can be things like grenade launchers, the heavy plasma machine guns with 3 barrels, and some other cool stuff of that nature. So there's definitely a lot of weapon variety in this game. And honestly, I kind of feel that the game front-loads its worst part. Not that the initial city is bad, per se, it's just very simple. You have very basic enemies, and there aren't very many different kinds of them, and you're only going to be finding a couple of very basic kinds of weapon. But after you get past the city part, everything beyond that gets a lot more exciting and interesting. The layouts of the levels get more interesting, the tile sets that you're actually looking at are more interesting, the enemy types are a lot more varied and have a lot more different attack patterns to learn, and are just more interesting to fight in general. And overall, this kind of makes me wish for the ability to purchase something that lets me start past the city so I don't have to do the city every time I begin a new run. Because after a couple of runs, you'll be so powerful from all the upgrades that you've purchased and the better weapons that you found and things, that the city area is no threat at all, and it's basically just busy work, because everything dies in one hit, the bosses last for like maybe 5 or 10 seconds, and then you're done. And it's just kind of a little bit annoying to have to go through that every single time. I kind of wish I could just start at the dock area, and then maybe once I beat the dock area a couple times I could start at the heights or whatever, you know what I mean? It would be nice to have the ability to skip some of the earlier levels, because they are a bit tedious after you've done them a bunch of times, because there's just not a lot of variety in them compared to what the rest of the game has afterwards. I would also say the game needs a little bit of extra variety in terms of the types of upgrades that you can find, the augments, especially the class augments, because what's there is really interesting, so it would be nice to have a couple more that maybe enable some other playstyles or have some other exotic features that make the classes work differently. And it would also be nice to have a little more variety in the equipable active skills that you can find, like I mentioned, the plasma grenades and the auto turrets and all that stuff, because there are actually only a few of them, like maybe 5 or 6, and they're not that interesting, and they're honestly not that useful either. Pretty much past the city, you just won't be using them very much, because your normal weapons are just simply a better way to deal with everything, and these utility items have the potential to be really interesting and have some build accentuating features that work with different classes differently, enable all sorts of things, but they don't really do that. They're actually kind of boring, and you're honestly kind of safe to ignore them most of the time, because they're just not all that useful. But even though there are a couple of sections of the game that I feel could use a little bit more variety, or maybe the ability to skip certain sections once you've done them enough times, some small features like that, I still think it's a really solid game. It's actually a really good roguelite third-person shooter because the combat is good, the weapon variety is fun, the enemy variety is very good, by the way, something I didn't mention. Very important to this genre is having a lot of different enemies to actually face off against, and after you get past the city, the enemy variety really ramps up in complexity and becomes pretty interesting to fight. So yeah, overall, I would say ArcRunner is actually quite good and an easy one to recommend if you like roguelites, because it is doing the third-person shooter kind of thing, which is a bit different for this genre. That's not that common to find, and it reminds me a little bit of Deadlink, honestly, in terms of how it feels, which is a compliment, because Deadlink feels great to play, and so does this. So I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page to ArcRunner if you wish to check it out for yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.